Nicodemus here. Simple question. What is fear and why do we experience it?
Well, if we start with the acronym FEAR, I heard this many years ago, false evidence appearing real. And what actually is fear? Like, what does it come from? I mean, we know what it feels like in our body. And when you're in a state of fear, it's almost as though we're stuck inside of a room by ourselves, disconnected from, it's a feeling of like hell, really. If you look at fear itself, you feel abandoned, isolated, alone, and it's so encompassing that in A Course in Miracles says when we're afraid, we're not even really alive. So obviously let's talk about fear from the perspective of our minds open to two thought systems. And one of them is built on fear. That the teacher of that thought system is the ego, and the other is built on love, peace, whatever you want to quote. The thing about the thought system is when you take a thought of the thought system, you get all of the thought system. So you could say love, peace, joy, freedom, abundance. That thought system is built on love, and the teacher of that thought system is the Holy Spirit or spirit, higher self, the inner guru. Now, what actually is fear? So I think the Course says it the best. It says all fear is ultimately reducible to the basic misperception that you have the ability to usurp the power of God. So I'll say that again. It's very simple, actually, what it says. All fear is ultimately reducible to the basic misperception that you have the ability to usurp the power of God. So if you think about what fear is and what happens when we're afraid, what it says in the Course is you're basically trying to kick God off the throne and put yourself on and try to be general manager of the universe, really, of your life. Even though you and I don't know what anything is for, what we see is very limited. If you look at it from a quantum physics perspective, we don't even see reality at all. We're omitting a lot of reality and saying this thing that I see is it. Now, false evidence appearing real, fear, it's whatever this thing is, this person, this event, this situation. I have what I consider evidence. It's not really based in reality. It's false evidence that appears real. So it takes a situation and it puts a slant on it from my past, from my hurts and my wounds and the scarcity I've bought into, all of what the ego has sold us on this thought system. So what we're really doing is we're basically attempting to say to God, like, no, this is bad. This shouldn't be. And if I was running things, it wouldn't be like this. And that's really what's happening when we're afraid. And people don't really realize that this is what they're doing. So going back to that, all fear is ultimately reducible, meaning you could reduce it down to its very basic core minimum. All it is this idea in your mind that you have the ability, which you don't have, by the way, which is what actually keeps us safe, is that you and I could never usurp the power of God. It's laughable. Like that would be the equivalent. Let me give you an analogy. I read this many years ago somewhere. I don't even know where I read it. That this is what the ego, the equivalency, compared to what spirit, Christ, God is ultimately. This analogy, imagine a blade of grass somewhere in the world, one blade, casts off a shadow. That little shadow is like the ego, and God, the Holy Spirit, is like the sun. Like, does the sun know anything of that shadow of this blade of grass somewhere in this random place on the face of the earth? Like, that's laughable. It's not even in the same dimension. That shadow, that doesn't even exist in the world of the sun. And it's the same for us. When you look at that shadow that's being cast off of that blade of grass, it's like that shadow we're seeing that little shadow and screaming our fist of like, I want it thus. So anytime we're afraid, it's almost like a perceptual temper tantrum of, if this were different, if the situation were different, if I could control it more, if I could predict the future, if I could protect myself, if I can make provisions for myself, because look at the world won't make provisions for me and God won't make provisions for me. So it's up to me to be afraid and to worry and to try to grasp some sense of semblance for myself. Like it's a defense mechanism. And what it's doing, it boils down to this idea that I could usurp. So this word usurp is very interesting. If you ever watch some of these old like Viking shows, the usurper, you know, some of you, if you've watched Game of Thrones, or the usurper is someone that's trying to take over the throne. So if there's a king or there's a queen and somebody's plotting against the king or the queen, they're considered a usurper because they're trying to knock the king or queen off the throne and put themselves on. So what we're trying to do is usurp the power of God, which is saying, I can parent myself. I don't need you as my creator, an extension of eternity and the mother, father, whatever you want to call it. I don't need that. I know how to make provisions for myself. And this is the story of the prodigal son, like leaving the kingdom, going to search for my own kingdom, even though I live in, and my father's the king or my mother's the queen. You know, that's my parents. I leave the kingdom and go search for my own kingdom. So of course I'm afraid. That's the authority problem that the Course talks about, is that you and I are like little kids that are trying to parent ourselves. So of course we're afraid. If we then submit, surrender, if you will, not my will, but thy will, whatever you would have for me, you know what's best. I'll listen. I'll just work on being a really good listener. It's impossible to be afraid. They cancel each other out. So it's either one or the other. So why people are afraid is they rely on their own strength too much and their own ability to try to predict the future, which is impossible. We're horrible at that. Why would I attempt to predict the future that I have no idea how it's going to show up when the Holy Spirit knows all past, present, and future and has all of time? That the Holy Spirit, as a teacher, at that disposal of just showing us. Why would I rely on my own strength? And all fear comes from relying on my own strength and not trusting in that I'll be provided and provisions will be made for me. That's why this is the complete abolishing of fear. Is I place the future in the hands of God. I place the future in the hands of God, which the Course says that means I place the past and the present. If I place the future in the hands of God, what is there to be afraid of? Fear is nowhere and fear is nothing. And that's what you see, is it's really a hallucination that just tempts us to like, listen to me. And we turn away from God, which is where all the strength comes from. And then we give in to the fear. And then the fear, that's why the Course says when you're afraid, you're not really even alive, because you cut off the connection, the communication to God, which is our strength. So they cancel each other out. If you trust in the strength of God and know that you're being led, and I place the future in the hands of God, it's impossible to be afraid. If you place the future in your own hands and you try to control and defend, you can't help but be afraid. And that's why people are afraid, like where the fear comes from and why we're really afraid.